Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this week's discussion. And what we're going to talk about today is one of the most common questions I get, which is how do you get a divorce? Just generally. So, as a divorce mediator and premarital mediator, one of the biggest questions I get is just how do I do it? Because it can be very challenging and also very confusing. So, today we're going to break it down into what process options you have for getting a divorce. There are three main ones. I'm going to say two I like, one I don't love. I'll explain through the video why that is. So, your first option is what's called litigation, which is going to court and hiring attorneys. Now, litigation is going to be the most common that people think of. Why is this? Well, the news, media, you see things on Instagram, movies, TV, people who are hiring attorneys and going through their divorce process. And it makes sense. It's a legal process, so you hire an attorney. It equals one to the other in most people's minds. Why litigation is not always the best for everyone? First, it's a very adversarial process. What that means is you are against one another, and that causes fighting and arguments. So you have to think when you're going through a court process, it's one person against another, party A versus party B. This means there's naturally going to be conflict between the two of you. So it's already raising the conflict that you likely have with your relationship as it is. The other thing, too, is it's going to be the most expensive and the longest process to get a divorce. I'm going to use Arizona as an example because I'm here in Arizona, but every state's going to be a little bit different. So, in Arizona, for example, each person pays about $25,000 to get a divorce. That's an individual. That means as a couple, they're paying about $50,000 to get a divorce. Very expensive and complex. So, as a comparison, when you got married, if you even remember, you probably went and got a marriage license or marriage certificate. It's the least exciting part of your marriage process, so most people don't even remember what they did. Typically, go to court, you get a license or piece of paper, and you pay, depending on your state, $25 for it. Then you typically have it signed, and then you return it to the court for it to be filed. Depends on your state's process. In the divorce, it's a multiple step process that's on a specific timeline. And so it's very, very important that you use a process. Why that process is going to be extended in terms of how long it is with litigation is because you're waiting on the court's timeline. So, kind of like when you get called for jury duty, it's not on a day that works for you, it's on a day that works for the court. Similar to that. You have to wait for your judge to be available. So your process is typically, for example, in Arizona, going to be at least a year long to finalize your divorce if you go through litigation in the court. So you're paying about $50,000, much different than that $25 that you paid to get married, and then your process is going to be at least a year. Now, it's going to depend on the circumstances that you are in, but if your process goes into what's called trial, which is before the judge, it can get even more pricey. So, for example, I had a couple who came to me a few years ago. They had been in litigation for 2 years. They had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they said it wasn't going anywhere. Their attorneys weren't moving it forward. They just weren't getting anywhere. They weren't reaching any agreements. In my process, mediation, which we're going to talk about next, the same couple met for 4 hours. We reached all of their agreements and we finalized everything in a month. So, very different timelines in terms of being able to control your agreements and move your process forward on your timeline. Now, the second option, which I mentioned, is mediation. Mediation is where a third party neutral helps you go through your divorce process. That mediator helps you both communicate and reach agreements on all major issues, which typically fall into three categories. Support, such as spousal support, which is also called spousal maintenance or alimony, and child support if you have minor children, a parenting plan if you have minor children, and then also division of assets and debts. Your mediator helps you reach all of those agreements, and then depending on your mediator, they may help you draft and file those agreements to finalize your divorce without you ever going to court, Or it may be that you have them draft up kind of a memorandum. It's called an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, what you agreed to, and then you have to give it to another professional to draft it. In either regard, it's going to be less expensive and a shorter process. So, for example, in Arizona, our process in mediation typically takes about 2 to 5 months to complete. That being said, it's going to differ based on the state, primarily because there's something called a waiting period in a lot of states. So in Arizona, our divorce waiting period is 60 days. Your process can't be shorter than 60 days. So that's why 2 to 5 months. But you control your timeline. So if you wanted your process to take a year, you can take a year in mediation. It's up to you. The price is also going to be substantially different. So, as we talked about in litigation, average in Arizona for a couple is $50,000. Average with mediation is about 5 to 7. So you're paying an astronomically lower amount to finalize your divorce. And that's not per person, that's for both of you combined. So 50,000 versus 5,000, for example. So those are going to be your two main options, the processes that I recommend for a divorce. There's a third option, which is do it yourself. Why don't I love do it yourself? Well, as someone who is a divorce professional, who has a background as an attorney, a mediator, and a certified divorce financial analyst, I just see all of those traps in doing it yourself. So first, the court doesn't make the paperwork very easy to complete. And even if you try and complete it, it's very limited. So there's certain court documents that can't be used if you have certain assets, like retirement accounts or other complex assets. It's very limited in the options that you have, so you lack the ability to have creativity or really even be able to write in an agreement that you want that doesn't match the checkboxes for the court. This is particularly common with house agreements and also parenting agreements. It's very limited because they're cookie cutter agreements. They're standards that might not meet what you need for you and your family. They also have a complex process. You have multiple filings, as we talked about. So you have to be on top of when do you file, how many copies do you make, how do you file them. So it's making it very complex. What I see a lot of times is a divorce process is typically 3 sets of documents at a minimum: the initial filing, the response, and the final decree or settlement. What I see as a common mistake is people who do it themselves do the petition and the response, and they're like, well, we both filed, we're done. Then their case gets dismissed, they lose all the money that they paid for their filing fees, and they have to start all over again because they didn't know how to finalize the process. So it's just very complex and timeline oriented. If you and your spouse are people who, let's say, you know what you want to agree to, you don't need to go to mediation. You don't need a court or attorneys to help you reach your agreements. In that case, you might use what's called a document preparer. So for some of my clients, they don't need help reaching agreements. They just need help filing and making sure the documents are drafted correctly. So a document drafter basically gives you a questionnaire. You fill it out with all of your agreements. Then we draft it. And in some instances, like myself, a document drafter will actually file them with the court for you. That way, it's going to be a much lower cost option, but it's still going to allow you to do it correctly and not have to do it multiple times or figure it out on your own. So that's going to be your 3 main options, is basically attorneys with litigation, mediation, and document preparation. I want to just preface, attorneys are important throughout your process. Even if you're in mediation, it's not as though you lose access to attorneys. I have clients who reference attorneys outside of mediation, or they bring their attorneys with them to their meeting, and I give them a list of recommended attorneys. You should always have access to legal advice if you want it. Even if you're using a document preparer, they could prepare your documents and then you could have an attorney review them. It's important to still have access to them. And I'm not saying that they're not a good resource, because they absolutely are. And I work with some wonderful attorneys that I refer my clients to. It's just understanding that you can still work in a collaborative way where you're working with a mediator and still getting help from an attorney at a much lower cost than going through the entire process through litigation. That's going to be the biggest difference. So that's how you go through a divorce in terms of your options. I always recommend calling and doing some consults with different professionals. That way you can get a sense of what is going to be the best option for you. Your professional should always help you answer your questions and let you know what your process is going to be. It should scare you. It should be really helping guide you to what is going to be the most thoughtful approach for you and your family. So if you have any questions, please add them to the comments below or reach out to Couple Solutions Center. All the information is below in the comments. So you can always reach out with any questions, and I will be back next week with another question that I have from my clients. See you then.